Hey, everybody, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at a couple things that might seem a little bit separate at first, but stick with us because we think you'll find some interesting parallels here. We're going to start by examining the latest developments from the front lines in Ukraine, particularly in a town called Velyka Novosilka.
Okay.
And then we're going to switch gears a little bit and look back at the Trump presidency here in the U.S. and see how some of his campaign promises actually played out.
Sounds fascinating. What kind of sources are we working with today?
Well, we've got some pretty raw firsthand accounts from Ukrainian soldiers who are fighting in Velyka Novosilka.
Okay.
And then on the U.S. side, we'll be analyzing a specific event that took place during Trump's time in office that really sheds light on his approach to governing.
All right, so let's start with Ukraine then. Why is this town, Velyka Novosilka, so important?
Well, it's in the Donetsk region,
Yeah.
which has been a major focal point of the conflict. And what we're hearing from these soldiers in the 110th Separate Mechanized Brigade is that the situation there is becoming increasingly dire.
Wow.
They're actually drawing some comparisons to their experience fighting in Avdiivka, which was another really hard-hit location. But they're saying that the challenges they're facing in Velyka Novosilka are even greater.
Avdiivka was practically leveled in the fighting, wasn't it? What kind of comparisons are they making?
Yeah, Avdiivka saw some of the most intense fighting of the entire war.
Right.
And the soldiers are saying that in Avdiivka, their biggest problem was lack of ammunition.
Okay.
But in Velyka Novosilka, they're facing a critical shortage of manpower.
So even if they have the weapons and ammunition, they don't have enough soldiers to effectively use them.
Exactly. They describe this grueling daily routine of constantly repelling these small groups of Russian troops who are trying to advance, often under the cover of darkness or bad weather.
Oh, wow. That sounds incredibly challenging. I mean, small mobile units like that would be really difficult to target with artillery or drones, even if they do have sufficient weaponry.
You're absolutely right. And one of the soldiers was actually quoted as saying, "The brigade's forces destroy more enemies per day than we have personnel in some of our own battalions."
Wow. That's pretty striking. I mean, that really gives you a sense of how serious the situation is. It suggests that the Ukrainian forces in Velyka Novosilka are stretched incredibly thin, potentially even to the point of exhaustion.
Yeah, it's a very different picture from what we were hearing earlier in the conflict, about this highly motivated Ukrainian populace eager to defend their country.
Yeah, it does seem like that initial wave of enthusiasm and volunteerism might be waning as the war drags on and the casualties mount.
Yeah.
There's this growing sense of fatigue and uncertainty, and that's bound to have an impact on recruitment efforts.
Yeah, and to make matters even more complex, there seem to be these conflicting narratives emerging about the situation in Velyka Novosilka.
Oh, what way?
Well, while these soldiers on the ground are painting this very dire picture, the official statements that are coming from the Ukrainian military are offering a much different perspective.
That's not uncommon in wartime, though, is it? I mean, governments often try to control the flow of information, particularly when it comes to sensitive matters like military operations.
Right. The Ukrainian army is actually denying that the town is on the verge of collapse.
Okay.
They're assuring the public that the situation is under control and that troops can retreat if necessary.
That's interesting. It seems like they're trying to project this image of strength and confidence, perhaps, to avoid public panic or to maintain that international support.
Yeah, it definitely makes it difficult to know what to believe.
Right.
You've got these firsthand accounts from soldiers who are in the thick of the fighting saying they're desperately short on manpower.
Right.
And then you have these official statements from the military saying everything is under control.
Yeah, that's a classic example of the fog of war, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's incredibly difficult to get a clear and accurate picture of what's happening in an active conflict zone, especially when there are strategic reasons to control information.
Okay, so let's switch gears now and talk about Donald Trump and his track record on fulfilling his campaign promises.
Okay, what specific promise are we focusing on?
We're going to look at his pledge to drain the swamp in Washington. And the event we're analyzing is his very controversial dismissal of several inspectors general across various government agencies.
Oh, I remember that. That happened all in one evening, right?
It did.
A lot of people saw that as a blatant attempt to remove anyone who might challenge his authority.
It definitely raised some eyebrows. And for those who might not be familiar with what an inspector general is, they aren't just these bureaucratic figureheads. They serve as independent watchdogs. Their whole job is to monitor government activities for waste, fraud, and abuse.
Right. They're essentially the eyes and ears of the public, making sure that things are running honestly and efficiently.
Exactly. And they're supposed to be free from political pressure, which is why their independence is so crucial.
So when Trump fired them, it sent shockwaves through Washington. I mean, it seemed to directly contradict his campaign promise to clean up corruption and hold people accountable.
It really raised questions about his true motives. Was he trying to protect himself and his allies from scrutiny?
Right.
Was he trying to undermine the very concept of independent oversight?
And it wasn't just his political opponents who were concerned either. Even some members of his own party expressed unease about the dismissals.
Yeah, suggesting that it wasn't just this partisan issue, but something much more fundamental about the balance of power and the importance of these checks and balances within a democracy.
Right. It really gets to the heart of the question. What happens when a leader who campaigned on transparency and accountability starts dismantling the very mechanisms that are meant to ensure those things?
It's a question that has implications far beyond the Trump presidency.
It certainly does. It forces us to think critically about the nature of political promises, the role of oversight and accountability, and that very delicate balance of power in a democracy.
It makes you wonder, how do we as citizens ensure that those in power are held accountable for their actions, even when they try to shield themselves from scrutiny? That's a question we should all be asking ourselves, I guess.
Yeah.
So let's unpack these two situations a bit further. We've got these conflicting narratives about what's happening in Velyka Novosilka, with the soldiers on the ground saying one thing and the Ukrainian military saying something completely different. How can we, as people following this conflict from a distance, even begin to make sense of it all?
Well, it's a real challenge, isn't it? You have to remember that in any war, information becomes a weapon. Both sides have a vested interest in shaping the narrative to their advantage.
So it's not just about trying to figure out who's telling the truth, but also about understanding, the motivations behind the information they're putting out there.
Exactly. Let's start with the soldiers. They're the ones on the front lines facing the enemy every single day. Their perspective is going to be shaped by those immediate experiences, the dangers they're facing, the losses they're witnessing.
And they're the ones who are most directly impacted by this manpower shortage, right?
Right.
So it makes sense that they would be sounding the alarm, trying to get reinforcements and support.
Absolutely. Their accounts, while subjective, they offer valuable insight into the reality on the ground. They're not necessarily trying to deceive anyone, but they're definitely trying to get their message across and make sure that their needs are being heard.
Right. And on the other hand, you have the Ukrainian military leadership who have a very different set of priorities.
Yeah.
They're thinking about the big picture.
Yeah.
The strategic implications of this conflict.
Right.
The impact on morale, both at home and abroad.
They're also dealing with the very real threat of Russian propaganda and disinformation. They need to maintain a certain level of control over the narrative in order to counter those efforts and to project an image of strength and unity.
So when they downplay the severity of the situation in Velyka Novosilka, they're probably doing it for a number of reasons. I mean, they don't want to cause panic among the population. They don't want to give the enemy any propaganda victories.
Right.
And they certainly don't want to risk losing that international support.
It's a delicate balancing act, trying to be honest about the challenges that they're facing without undermining confidence in their ability to win the war.
Right. Which brings us back to that crucial question for anyone who's following this conflict.
Yeah.
How do you navigate these competing narratives and form your own conclusions about what's actually happening?
It required a critical eye and a healthy dose of skepticism. You can't just take everything at face value. You need to consider the source, the context, the motivations, and the potential biases at play.
And you need to be willing to dig a little deeper.
All right.
To look for evidence and analysis from a variety of sources, including independent journalists, researchers, and analysts. It's like a process of piecing together information from different perspectives and trying to form a more complete picture.
And even then, it's important to acknowledge that there will always be some degree of uncertainty. War is inherently chaotic and unpredictable, and the information is often incomplete, unreliable, or even deliberately misleading.
So how can we apply this same kind of critical thinking to the situation with Trump and the inspectors general?
Well, let's go back to that night when he dismissed all those inspectors general. Remember, these were individuals who had been appointed by previous administrations, both Democratic and Republican. They were supposed to be nonpartisan and independent, dedicated to rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse in the government.
Right. And Trump fired them all in one fell swoop, which immediately raised red flags for a lot of people.
It did. It seemed like a blatant attempt to shield himself and his administration from scrutiny.
Especially when you consider the context of some of the investigations that were underway at the time.
Oh, yeah.
There were inquiries into his dealings with foreign governments, his business practices, and his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. It looked very much like he was trying to get rid of anyone who might uncover wrongdoing.
And his justifications for the firings were often vague or unconvincing. He would accuse some of the inspectors general of being disloyal or of having political motivations, but he rarely provided any concrete evidence to actually support those claims.
It seemed more like an attempt to discredit them and to undermine public trust in their investigation.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that this wasn't an isolated incident. Trump repeatedly attacked and undermined institutions and individuals that he perceived as threats to his power.
Oh, absolutely.
Including the media, the intelligence community, even the judicial system.
It was part of a broader pattern of behavior that raised serious concerns about his respect for the rule of law and for democratic norms.
So how do we connect this back to his promise to drain the swamp?
Well, it seems pretty clear that he didn't exactly deliver on that promise. In fact, you could argue that he actually made the swamp worse.
How so?
Well, by eroding accountability and undermining trust in those government institutions.
He surrounded himself with loyalists, often overlooking experience and qualifications in favor of personal allegiance.
Yes. And he created this culture of impunity where rules were routinely ignored and norms were flouted.
Which ultimately raises the question, can we trust politicians to keep their promises?
It's a question that's relevant not just to Trump, but to any politician, regardless of party or ideology.
Right. We need to be critical thinkers. We need to scrutinize their actions, and we need to hold them accountable for their words and their deeds.
And that's something that each of us can do. We can pay attention to what's happening in our communities and in the world. We can engage in thoughtful discussions and debates, and we can use our voices and our votes to demand better from our leaders.
These two stories, though seemingly unrelated, actually highlight some important commonalities.
Oh, absolutely. They both demonstrate how power can be used to manipulate information and to undermine accountability. And they both underscore the need for vigilance and critical thinking in a world where truth is often elusive, and those in power are not always acting in our best interests.
So what can we as individuals do to navigate this complex and often treacherous landscape?
Well, one of the most important things we can do is to cultivate a healthy skepticism.
Okay.
Don't just accept everything you read or hear at face value, especially when it comes from sources that have a vested interest in shaping the narrative.
We need to be willing to question everything, to seek out diverse perspectives and to do our own research.
Absolutely. And we need to be aware of our own biases and how they might be influencing our perceptions and interpretations of events. None of us are immune to bias, but by acknowledging it, we can at least try to mitigate its effects.
We need to remember that information is power. And those who control the information often control the narrative. It's up to us to be discerning consumers of information, to seek out the truth, and to hold those in power accountable.
Well said. It's an ongoing challenge, but it's a challenge worth taking on. Because the future of our democracies depends on it.
You know, it feels like we're constantly being bombarded with information these days. And it's not always easy to separate fact from fiction.
It's true. We live in an age of information overload, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to know what to believe.
Especially when you have, powerful forces that are deliberately trying to mislead and manipulate you.
Right. Whether it's governments trying to control the narrative during wartime or politicians trying to, spin the truth to their advantage.
Right.
It's more important than ever to be critical thinkers.
So what are some practical steps we can take to kind of navigate this complex information landscape?
Well, I think the first step is to be aware of your sources.
Okay.
Who's providing the information and what are their motives? Are they trying to inform you or persuade you?
It's also important to look for evidence, right?
Absolutely.
Don't just take someone's word for it. Are there facts and data to support their claims? Are there other credible sources that corroborate their story?
And be wary of anything that seems too good to be true or too perfectly aligned with a particular agenda.
Right.
There are always multiple sides to every story, and it's important to consider all of them before forming your own opinion.
Yeah. It's like being a detective,
Yeah.
piecing together clues from different sources and trying to figure out what's the most plausible explanation.
Exactly. And sometimes the most important clues are the ones that are missing.
Oh, interesting.
What aren't they telling you? What information is being left out?
It also helps to be aware of our own biases, right?
Absolutely.
We all have them, and they can influence how we perceive and interpret information. So It's important to acknowledge those biases and try to be as objective as possible.
And don't be afraid to change your mind.
Oh, that's a good one.
If new evidence emerges that challenges your beliefs, be open to revising your position. That's the hallmark of a true critical thinker.
So to wrap things up, it seems like both of these stories, the situation of Velyka Novosilka and Trump's actions as president really highlight the importance of informed skepticism.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. We need to be engaged citizens, but we also need to be critical thinkers.
Right.
We need to question everything, to demand evidence, and to be wary of those who try to manipulate us with misinformation and propaganda.
It's not always easy, but it's essential if we want to make informed decisions and hold those in power accountable.
And never underestimate the power of your own voice. Speak up, challenge the status quo, and demand better from your leaders.
Well said. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
It's been a pleasure.